are back on the Zero Hour. I'm your host, Richard RJ Eskow. Many of us are still struggling to make sense out of the entirely predictable and predicted, and yet still somehow surprising to many people, Supreme Court decision reversing Roe v. Wade. Here to talk that through with us once again is Kathryn Kolbert. Kathryn Kolbert, that's with two Ks, is a public interest attorney as well as a journalist and an entrepreneurial leader. She has appeared more than once before the United States Supreme Court. She argued Planned Parenthood versus Casey, which was widely credited with saving Roe v. Wade. Of course, we now know that that saving was not a permanent one, but it saved it for many years. And she's here to discuss this recent decision and the path forward now. So first of all, Kathryn Kolbert, thanks for coming back and joining us once again.
Thanks, Richard. I wish I could be here in better circumstances.
As do I. I guess first, kind of a personal note. We all knew this was coming. We all knew it would be every bit as horrible in terms of its phrasing, its language, and its intent, and of course, it being the Supreme Court decision. And yet, I don't know, the feeling for some of us, including me, is almost as grim as if it were an utter surprise. Do you feel the same way, or do you understand that emotion? Can you parse it at all?
Well, Richard, I think about it as if you are driving down the road and you start to skid and you know you're going to hit something, right? You know there's going to be an accident. There's a big difference between knowing there's an accident coming and actually having it occur. And that's what's happened here. I mean, I expected Roe to be reversed in 1992. So the fact that we had 30 years was a surprise to me in many respects. But and we've known as early as Hillary Clinton losing the election that we are set up for Trump to nominate at least one, if not more, justices to the court. So frankly, we knew this was coming for a long time. But, and this is a big but, the language of the opinion, the adoption of anti-abortion rhetoric, the heart of elimination of a fundamental right for the first time in history, is so shocking to one's being. So I can't describe it except for the women I know who burst into tears and think about this as a loss of control and a loss of their own integrity and autonomy. That is just so striking and so objectively crazy that it comes as a shock.
Yes, and I think there has been, despite all the setbacks of recent decades, of the 2016 election loss and other recent events, I think underlying what we might call the liberal mindset, I think there's been for at least 50 years a sense that history has an underlying progress to it, and that a freedom once won won't be taken back. We'll build on it. We'll go from here to something else. We'll go from here to something else. And the idea that a fundamental freedom can be taken away, like you say, a long skid ends in a sudden crash, right? Just like that. I think that's a shock to the system for a lot of people. It has caused many people to reevaluate their sense of, not just their sense for women. What we already know that some 26 million women of reproductive age are already affected by this, and in states that are immediately acting to take away reproductive freedoms. But everyone in this country now, I think, viscerally understands that any freedom can be taken away at any time. Am I overstating the case?
Well, certainly those that are dependent upon the Liberty Clause of the 14th Amendment, this court has made that very clear that they can be taken away. And frankly, they're forsaking of traditional notions of stare decisis, basically saying if we disagreed with the underlying opinion, we can take it away. We can change what the court thinks about this issue. And that is not only affront to principles that have been part of our government and part of our law since the founding of the nation, but just scary because the reason they are doing that is because they are imposing a very extreme ideological view of the way the world ought to operate. Reminiscent of the 1950s or the 1940s or sometimes the 1920s. It's scary. And I think that they don't get that different people in the world operate differently than 55 and 60-year-old white men who are sitting on that court, and one woman who clearly lives in a different age. So I feel like it's disturbing because it's so viscerally shocking, but it's disturbing as well because they eliminate the bedrock principles of our democracy, and they're doing so because of extreme ideological views.
And Kathryn Kolbert, help us understand the implications of stare decisis and what they've done to it, of precedent, right? In effect, for all the years that this country has been in existence and the Supreme Court has been in existence, judicial system overall, basically, as I understand it, the idea has been, obviously major changes have come through our judicial process. We've had Dred Scott decision. We've had all sorts of things legalizing, or I should say, justifying slavery before slavery was outlawed and so on. So, of course, profound philosophical, moral shifts have been undertaken by this country. But the underlying principle, as I understand it, has been once a profound moral decision has been undertaken, it is considered settled unless some fundamental principle is unearthed that forces us to reevaluate it. I suspect I'm mangling it and oversimplifying it, but is that roughly the idea?
Yeah, I mean, the basic principle is twofold. One is the law shouldn't change by the willy-nilly views of individual justices. There needs to be some consistency because Americans rely upon the law to regulate and establish their rights. I mean, women every day were making decisions about whether or not to have children, which is probably the most profound decision they make in any relationship that they are in. And so that is really key, number one. But number two, in the legal sphere, it's known as the reliance interest, that in those instances where Americans have relied very heavily on the court's view, there needs to be additional compelling reasons to change that. And here we're talking about a ruling that has been relied upon for 5 decades by millions and millions of Americans. Pregnant women, about 1 in 4 have an abortion at some point during their lifetime. That's 25% of all pregnant women. I mean, this is a huge number of people. I mean, just if you think about the scope of what's happened, we expect that some 26 states will ban abortion as a result of this ruling. We're talking about 300 to 400,000 women a year who live in those states who are facing unintended pregnancies. Not just all pregnancies, just unintended pregnancies. This ruling affects all pregnancies. Because it really puts a huge, makes it very, very difficult to practice medicine appropriately in circumstances where women need to terminate a pregnancy to protect their health, even if it's a wanted pregnancy. So we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people affected immediately, not just within the next year, like right away. And that number is just about 40% of women of childbearing age will be living in states that ban abortion. So given the scope of the Reliance interest, again, the court in my case, in Planned Parenthood versus Casey, was very clear. There needs to be a compelling reason to change up what the law is, and there is none here. That's what they said in Casey. There's no change in the facts. There's no change in how women have relied upon the interest. There's no change in the law. The only change, and this is an important one because it tells a lot about this court and our nation's reliance on them going forward. The only change has been the individual justices on this court who were placed on the court with the specific purpose of overruling Roe and imposing their ideological views on the rest of us. And that is not a reason to forsake settled law. It's not a reason to place women in harm's way. It's not a reason to reverse what has been recognized for so long as the most fundamental freedom, the freedom to make a decision where, when, with whom, and how you have children.
You know, Kitty, I have been, one might say, morbidly fascinated, but fascinated with the psychology of these justices and of the entire anti-choice movement for many, many years now. And one of the things I think people in the reproductive freedom movement and progressives overall have failed to understand is the absolute relentlessness that, you know, and I've debated with them many times, going back to when I was a teenager and an uncle from Texas said, they didn't want you. You know, it made it very clear that if abortion had been an option, I would not have been born, which turned out to be true and did not change my position in any way. You know, I mean, utterly irrelevant to the ethics of the question. But, you know, one of the things, you know, if you're Susan Collins or whomever, Joe Manchin professing indignation that that whomever, Amy Coney Barrett or Neil Gorsuch or whomever told you they considered Roe settled law, don't they understand? Are they just being disingenuous, or don't they understand that the ethics, if you call it that, of this movement, in my view, are such that they will absolutely lie over and over again, because, and again, I'm expressing opinion, so forgive me for stating it as fact. I want your opinion, but they think that, quote unquote, saving the babies is worth lying to anybody and everybody. It's the ethical thing to do. And B, that it's especially ethical to lie to liberals because, you know, whomever you want to name in the United States Senate, because they're barely worthy of moral treatment anyway. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Well, let me just say, I absolutely agree with you that they are relentless, and they have been on this crusade to overturn Roe since within a few months after Roe was established in 1973. And I think there are two things that make them different and really leads to their success. One is that they are single issue voters, and that the coalition that they have developed that essentially took over the Republican Party. Because remember, Republicans weren't always anti-abortion. Republicans often were pro-choice in the early days. I mean, Barry Goldwater was pro-choice. Initially, Ronald Reagan was pro-choice.
Gerald Ford, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So there's lots and lots of Republicans who have been pro-choice over the years, but this anti-abortion segment not only are relentless single-issue voters, but they've taken over the Republican Party and made them bend to their views, and that we're seeing that today. even after this ruling has been handed down, you'd think, okay, they're happy, but they're not. They're going forward with a whole bunch of other agenda items that we can talk about in a bit.
Yeah.
But they're relentless, and they understand the politics, and most importantly, they understand power. And I think that's one of the reasons that I feel that the Democrats have really are disappointing us, because they aren't willing to exercise power in quite the same way. I think that means, unfortunately, that we don't go the extra mile to win, but we need to. And so I think the only way to solve this problem going forward, number one, is to make sure that Congress can pass a law, and then we have a president who can sign a law that reverses the court's ruling. Now, we have a House now that has already passed the law. Okay, we're in good shape, but we got to hold on to that House till the next term, because we don't have a Senate who's willing to either overcome the filibuster or has 60 votes to go beyond the filibuster. So in this next election, federally, we need to hold on to the House, we need to hold on to the presidency in 2024, and we need a Senate with at least 50 votes of people who are willing to say, abandon the filibuster to pass a law protecting reproductive freedom. That's what we need to do politically, and we need to be doing that just, 100 over and over and over again. I need to say we have to get political. We have to establish power, because this is a fight for power. But second, we got to look at all those legislatures, those 26 states. And to me, it's actually even more important. We've got 26 states that are banning abortion. Every time we can turn one of those states, we're freeing up the ability of women to obtain procedures in the meantime. For example, Kansas has a referenda on the ballot in the primary that says that the state constitution of Kansas does not include the right to choose abortion. If we can defeat that measure, the Kansas Supreme Court, in my view, is likely to uphold the rulings they've already made, finding a state constitutional right and permitting abortion in Kansas. Really critical. 4 weeks from now, okay? Mm-hmm. We have in state after state after state gubernatorial races, state legislative races. I live in Pennsylvania. If we don't win the governor's race and flip one house of the legislature, we could see a ban on abortion in Pennsylvania as early as next January. I think that all of us, every one of us who believes that reproductive choice ought to be a fundamental freedom for all people who can get pregnant, in my view, have to start thinking about winning political power. And the only way you do that is to defeat the bad guys, you send them home, and you establish people in power who care about your interests and your rights.
Tell you what we're going to hear, you probably heard it already, is, people will say, well, these loser Democrats who had all 50 years to codify Roe as law, who knew that they were gunning for it for almost all that time, who had a veto-proof majority under Obama in the Senate. They had the House, Senate, and presidency, didn't do it, and we're going to reward. And now, again, I'm just telling you what we'll hear. And we're going to reward them by going out and knocking on doors for them and voting for them in November. And what's your answer?
Okay, to that? Well, there's two answers. One is, I'm not sure there was ever the votes to establish the right completely. I think we had enough votes in many of those eras to establish a limited right, but poor women who depended on the government assistance for their health care, women who lived in rural areas, the most disenfranchised, would have been excluded from those bills. Remember, even under Obamacare, abortion was excluded because there wasn't enough votes. So I don't think it's correct, number one. But number two, it's even more important. What's the alternative?
Right.
right? You forsake the Democrats and you elect Republicans who not only will eliminate abortion, but will eliminate voting rights, will eliminate, climate change efforts, who will eliminate contraceptives, who
Right.
will eliminate gay marriage. I mean, we're talking about people who might impose a nationwide ban on abortion, which Mitch McConnell has already said he would consider. So I don't think the alternative is pretty. And frankly, let me just say, we saw it already. In 2016, we lost the presidential election. Donald Trump became president by 44,000 votes in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. There were more people voting for third-party candidates in each of those states than the margin of loss. And that is incredibly disturbing. Yes, you can be mad at the Democrats. Yes, hold their feet to the fire. Yes, make your voices known. But to not work for them to remain in power is just a silly and frankly, given the stakes, just makes no sense at all.
So let's talk a little bit about what might happen next to the court, and then other things we might be able to do. A lot of people are talking about Clarence Thomas's opinion, obviously, and you just mentioned a couple of things he mentioned in it. First of all, I think it sounds clear that this opinion was profoundly radical in the context of American law, right? Because it basically said any principle of continuity that governed the first couple hundred plus years of American law goes out the window.
Well, I think it actually does more than that, Richard, and let me explain.
Sure.
It outlines what it would take to establish fundamental freedoms under the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause. And what it says is you can't have a right unless, number one, it's explicitly mentioned in the Constitution. Well, many rights that we have, anything that is a result of the modern age, contraception, internet access, gay marriage, anything that is new in the world would be excluded. But they go even further and they say, and it has to be a part of our nation's history and traditions. Well, the reality is our nation's history and traditions did not include women and African Americans as citizens. They had no rights. We weren't in the Constitution.
Right.
So to say that we need a history of support throughout our country's history, that's crazy. It didn't happen, and it's never going to happen. So basically, they've created a rule that's always going to exclude people on the basis of gender and race.
Well, but our nation's history didn't include the right to drive an automobile because we didn't have automobiles.
Exactly.
Our nation's history didn't include the right to fire an AR-15 because we didn't have AR-15. I mean, you can equate an AR-15 to a musket, but now you're analogizing, which I gather is not something they permit.
Well, but in their view, the AR-15 is different because of the Second Amendment, which is they think
right to bear arms. I see. Yeah.
But the other point of this is that this philosophy is a direct hit on a bunch of rights that all of us care a lot about: contraception, in vitro, the ability to use fertility treatments and drugs, in vitro fertilization, for example, the ability to make decisions around end-of-life care, the ability to make decisions in one's pregnancy when that pregnancy is wanted, and the right to marry a person regardless of their race or regardless of their gender. These having sex. He basically says we ought to reconsider the sodomy decisions, which overturned laws that were incredibly punitive and forced law enforcement to invade the sacrosanct bedrooms of Americans. All of that is up in the air, and I think that Sam Alito's dismissive, well, this is different because it's abortion, it just doesn't make sense.
So all that life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness stuff is just flowery language, right? It
Well,
doesn't.
it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for certain people in our society, which is basically older white men.
So it's extremely radical, and basically they can do anything they want. I mean,
it's older white Christian men.
Well, see, the Christian thing,
they're really saying that only certain people are entitled to rights, and the rest of us be damned.
Right. So I suppose if a high school hired a Satanist coach, and the Satanist coach decided to hold rituals to Beelzebub at the 50-yard line, that would be okay because religious freedom applies to everyone, right?
I'm not sure the case would have come out the same way, frankly.
Yeah. So, I guess the profound radicalism, it argues, certainly to me, argues for an enlarging of the Supreme Court, which is something I've been for a long time. I don't know what else you do when you have a radical 6-person majority that looks pretty healthy, like they're going to be around for a long time. What else do we do? I mean, obviously we organize, we pass laws, we try to elect a Congress that will, execute the will of the people, which is clearly not the will of this congressional majority. But beyond that, what kind of reforms can we look to at the judicial level that will allow us to wrest our democracy away from the Supreme Court?
So, Richard, I do think focusing on state level political change and Congress is the first step, and more realistic, frankly, than changing the composition of the court, although it's certainly a worthwhile goal. We saw that even the threat of that under FDR made a difference in terms of the development of our law. And the threat of that, I think, is important. To me, the only proposal that makes sense is this 18-year term limits that allows every president to appoint 2 justices. That makes sense to me going forward as a much better way than just adding a couple of additional members, because we're still, you get 16 years of Republicans in control of the presidency, and you're back having more people against you. So I do think you have to be careful about how you, if you stack the court and you want to come up with proposals that make some sense and guarantees some ability to control who becomes a justice. But I think the other piece of this is, I think we just need to see our politicians fighting on our behalf.
Absolutely.
Okay, and that's important, but that's not going to happen unless we push them to do so. And every person who feels strongly about this issue has a responsibility to get active, to change the narrative, to get their friends working politically, and push the people you work for to take stands that are consistent with your beliefs. And I don't think we can blame it all on the party. We can't blame it all on the politicians. We can't blame it all on all of us who worked on this issue for the last 50 years. Yes, we made some mistakes, but it doesn't help to lay blame. The only thing that helps is to turn our agony into organizing, to turn our despair into action, to take the time, frankly, to get out there and knock on doors, listen to people, what they think, help them come to a decision close to your own. But to knock on doors, make phone calls, write texts. Our opponents have been doing this for 50 years, and we need to do it too.
That's a great conclusion, to which I would say, they say, don't get mad, get even. I say, get mad and get even by getting out there and organizing. As the great Joe Hill said, don't mourn, organize. Kathryn Kolbert, again, is a public interest attorney. She's a writer and an entrepreneurial leader. Her book is Controlling Women.
Oops, there you go.
What's that?
I said, there you go. I've just held up the book.
Oh, good. Okay. And as always, Kathryn Kolbert, thanks for your insights and thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, Richard. Happy to be here.
And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.